My name is Matt Daw. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I've got a shop in Greenpoint where I work on motorcycles. We're going to be deconstructing a 1974 Harley-Davidson shovelhead. Shovelhead's a nickname, actually, for the model. It's kind of like there's different eras. There's the knucklehead, the panhead, the shovelhead, and these are all nicknames that were given by different motorcycle riders because of the way they look. So the top rocker boxes on the motor, which are the very top chrome pieces with the two nuts, look like shovels. The panheads have like a more rounded shape. They look like pans, and the knuckleheads have two very distinct nuts at the top with a contoured cast rocker top. We're going to strip it down bare as minimal as it can, with the motor and transmission staying intact, everything else disassembled completely. Before we started this process, I've drained all the fluids already, the oil and the gas, to make sure everything is dry. When removing the gas tanks, you want to make sure there's no gasoline inside. You want to make sure the engine and the primary is free of oil, because otherwise you're going to have a mess when you take everything apart. Once all that is cleaned out and dried, that's when you start the process of dismantling the bike. I pull from my toolbox as needed and reset at different intervals throughout the deconstruction. Right here, I've already got my Phillips head screwdriver out, taking out the rear screw on the seat. There are two tongues in the front that slide under the frame, which keep it secured in the front. It's an aftermarket seat, kind of a little sleeker design than the stock. After removing the seat, you have access to the battery and electrical area. What you want to do then is disconnect the battery. And the reason you want to disconnect the battery before you do anything else is because when working on the bike, you're using metal tools, your hands are everywhere. You don't want to accidentally ground something or engage the starter by accident, or really give the bike any reason to have electricity running through it. I'm going to disconnect the ground terminal, then the positive terminal. I was very determined to find a bike that I was going to ride as opposed to take apart. And I found the bike in Albany. The guy was asking a fair price and borrowed a van and put my dog in the back and drove up to Albany. He got up out of bed at midnight, helped me push the bike into the back of the van, and that was it. We drove back that night. This right now, what I'm taking off is the air cleaner cover for the carburetor. Underneath this is an air filter. This is kind of a classic. It's called an S&S. It's a teardrop style. It's an aftermarket performance company for Harleys, and it's their iconic air cleaner. Next, we're going to start taking off the gas tank. Normally, there is a speedo right in the center where my hands are at this moment. That will give you your mileage reading, your speed. Sometimes there's a tachometer involved, which takes a RPM reading from the motor. Generally necessary for inspections, but also flies under the wire for a lot of guys who want custom bikes. Harley's always had, and probably always will have, a very cult following. It's very much more organic, and like the following is much more organic behind it, you know, and there's all the myth and the ethos behind of Harley being American, and there's not quite the same thing for any other brand. As much as there are extremists and purists for every other brand, it doesn't carry the same kind of culture around it. There's plenty of other companies that have nicknames on motors that people make up, but nothing sticks. Nobody's going to call this an FXE. Most of the time, it's just a shovelhead. I started working on bikes when I was 18 years old, got my first bike, couldn't afford to have anybody else work on it, so I had to learn from there, and I was kind of bumming around and getting information where I could and hanging around the shops and poking my head places that didn't belong. I opened up my own shop at one point in Newfoundland in Canada, which is where I'm from. After closing up shop there for an opportunity in New York, I've been here working on motorcycles, doing custom fabrication ever since. There's 3 points on these specific gas tanks where the hardware is mounted. So you've got the two top mounts, then there's one at the bottom of the frame where there's a little tab. These specific ones are two pieces that are connected by lines in the center for venting and gas flow. Billy's here with me, assisting me today, and everything that I'm taking off the bike, he's taking off camera and organizing, labeling, and making sure everything stays together where it should be. One side of these tanks is vented, the other is not, which creates a positive pressure flow, which is what creates all the gas going from one side to the other. There's only one outlet to the carburetor, which is through what's called a petcock. The petcock is a valve. There's 3 settings. There's on, off, and reserve. The reserve is at a height level. It saves you from being stuck on the side of the road. The best way to do it is to run it on, and if you do happen to run out of gas, that reserve will get you another 15, 20 miles. Depends on the size of your tank. Now that the tanks are off, we're going to go over and take off the carburetor, start from the manifold, and work our way out. This is what feeds the engine. This is your first line. The fuel comes in. It's very specifically designed to give it a certain air-fuel mixture. What I just did there was remove the throttle cable. The throttle control is on the right-hand side of the handlebars. You twist it, the cable pulls, it opens the carburetor. That's what controls how much air and fuel goes into the engine at any time, which is what controls your speed. So this is an S&S Super B carb. This one has an interesting aftermarket part that has an accelerator pump, which wasn't common of the era. The accelerator pump, basically when you crank the throttle, shoots a little bit extra gas into the motor first. So on startup and first initial acceleration, it kind of makes you go a little bit quicker. Right here I'm removing the top motor mount to the engine, which connects the two cylinder heads to the top of the frame. Throughout this process, we're going to be using standard hand tools, wrenches, ratchets, sockets, screwdrivers, and various Allen keys. The reason to use hand tools on a bike, it's just efficient, and also it's really important in a lot of circumstances to feel, to actually physically get a sense of feel for the bike. So you know if you're going to strip a bolt, if you're going to shear something, whereas if you had a power tool, if you were trying to remove something with like an impact gun, you wouldn't be able to actually feel the tension on the bolt, and you could end up breaking something, and it turns into a whole other process of like bolt removal and huge problems. There's 3 mounting points traditionally on most Harleys. You've got your front and your rear motor mounts, and then your top motor mount. I'm trying to remove the clamps from the manifold, so I take off the motor mount first and then have access to the clamps. The motor mount, it actually makes the engine itself a structural member of the whole chassis. In this model, it's rigid mounted. There's no buffer or dampening system between the motor and the frame. It's all hardware, metal to metal, full contact, whereas in later models you have high rubber dampers, a lot of like poly. The bike itself is pretty standard. It's almost 45 years old, as close to stock as it can be with some bolt-on modifications. This model in particular is the FXE, which is the Super Glide. That was the denotation of the era. The E stands for electric start, where you could get them at the time with kickstart only or kick and electric start, which was a new introduction for Harley of this era of like the 69 up shovel heads. Here I'm removing both clamps, and then it's just a little bit of a wiggle and a pull, and it's out. Now I'm going to get in and start taking apart the exhaust pipes. Basically the whole process here from the air cleaner now to the exhaust pipes is you're stripping everything off of the engine so you can have access to the engine to remove it easily. That's your main goal. That's a big milestone in taking apart the bike, is getting the motor and transmission out. These exhaust pipes on the shovel head, they have one bolt on each manifold that hold them in, and then the exhaust leads to a bracket which is attached to the frame and then attached to the rear of the exhaust as well, so it's mounted on multiple points. These are an aftermarket pipe. They're not baffled, so they're very loud. They don't add to performance in any kind of way. Because there's 2 cylinders, there's 1 exhaust pipe for each cylinder. In this and most road motorcycles, street motorcycles, are 4-stroke. There's 4 different movements of the piston to make the bike move. One sucks in the air, the other pushes up and creates a combustion, the fuel, then it drops down again. Then on the 4th stroke is when it pushes out the exhaust. So it's all in rhythm. And if you have something that's out of rhythm, your bike's not going to run right. And one thing that's important in that is the back pressure in the exhaust. So if your exhaust is escaping too quickly, the whole system is thrown out of whack. It's kind of like music, you know? Another way to think of it is like a pulse. So there's like a, say like every 2 seconds, there's a pop, 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 pop. But if it can't produce that right rhythm, the rest of the engine's going to run bad. The motorcycle's going to run off. One of the main stylistic features in custom motorcycles is custom exhaust. You can get aftermarket mufflers, but build all the rest of the exhaust from scratch, or build straight pipes like these with no baffles, and you just build the whole thing. These are what came on the bike. They wouldn't necessarily be my choice aesthetically, but this is what came on the bike, and high-end exhaust systems can be very expensive. Now that I have the exhaust off, I'm working on taking off the hardware. This specific exhaust system has slotted hardware which actually slides into the back of the exhaust. It's a really common system for most aftermarket and stock exhaust brackets. Now I'm taking off the forward highway pegs. These are an added accessory, not necessary to riding it whatsoever. It's more for comfort on longer trips when you can like stretch your legs out. And this here, the kickstand, is also attached to the left side of the highway peg here. The kickstand obviously is what holds the bike up when it's not mounted on a lift somewhere. So many varieties of kickstands and different operations. This is a very common one for shovel heads. I'm taking off the voltage regulator, which controls the flow to the battery. An alternator creates AC current, and the AC current goes to the regulator, which converts it to DC and sends it to the battery. The output of the alternator depends on the RPM of the motor, which sends so much electricity to the regulator. The regulator basically takes all that and says, here's 12 volts. It regulates everything so the battery's not going to explode. Right now I'm removing the right side brake pedal and foot peg. This is a standard brake mount setup for this kind of bike. It mounts to the transmission and tab on the frame. So this is just the bracket that holds the foot peg and the brake pedal on. Here I'm taking off the bolts for the exhaust bracket. The reason I'm doing this is because the exhaust bracket is holding the master cylinder. The master cylinder is what holds the hydraulic brake fluid, where these have a disc brake setup on the bike. It's run by pressure. There's a plunger at the end of the brake pedal that engages the plunger system in the master cylinder, which on the other side translates to fluid pressure. And now that I've got everything disconnected, I'm removing the brake pedal and the foot peg from the bike. Just continuing with the brake system, taking off the exhaust bracket and then taking off the master cylinder. They stopped producing the shovelhead in 1984 and switched to the Evo, which was nicknamed a blockhead, but that didn't really stick. A lot of the old bikers thought Harley lost its spirit in that era, so these are still like the nostalgic bikes, the panhead, the knucklehead, the shovelhead. I'm removing the starter solenoid, which engages the starter. It's part of the electric start system. Electrical is kind of the biggest mess you'll see on any bike, especially an old bike, because everybody thinks they have the right idea and nobody really understands. There's a lot of electrical tape and zip ties on stuff that shouldn't be there. There's a lot of like snipping and picking. When taking a bike apart, there's a certain amount of room to change the process, but you need to stick within certain confines. Like you can't take out the motor before you take off the gas tank. There's also a step-by-step process to follow that you need to stick to fairly rigidly to get everything apart the right way. So right now the battery tray is coming out. Underneath, mounted to that battery tray, is the starter relay, which sends the signal to the starter solenoid, which then sends the signal to the starter motor, which is just an electric motor that engages a gear system and literally pumps the engine over till it starts. I'm removing the left side shifter peg. And here I am just removing the foot peg as well. Just one bolt that holds it on, really simple. It's really basic, normal foot peg setup for this bike. Here we are removing the inspection cover on the primary. This is the inspection cover itself. It's called that because when you're doing maintenance on the bike, you can remove this cover and check the primary drive chain tension, just kind of see what's going on in there. You pop it open, you look inside, you check your chain tension. It's minimally invasive to do the maintenance that you need to do. Here I'm removing the derby cover. Once removing this, it gives you access to the clutch basket. It's what transfers the power from the engine to the transmission. Then the transmission, after going through the gear ratios in whatever configuration, sends the power to the rear wheel. Now I'm removing the full outer primary cover because, again, we're fully dismantling the bike. You need to take off the primary cover to get access to the inside of the primary, to take off the inner primary, which then gives you access to removing the motor. There's Billy cleaning the parts as they're coming off the bike. This is a parts washer. It's a 45-gallon drum of kerosene and a pump. And this is a housing that sits on top of the drum. And the pump, it's just a recirc pump. It sucks up the kerosene, shoots it out that nozzle, and then goes back down the drain. It just does that over and over and over again. And what that does is it cleans all the grease and gunk and whatnot from engine parts. One thing that's really important is that every nut and bolt, every piece of hardware, everything that comes off should all be bagged and organized, labeled, because when time comes to eventually put it back together, you want to know what everything is. You can't put all the nuts and bolts in one box and figure it out later. So when everything comes off the primary, everything gets labeled primary hardware. When everything comes off the foot controls, everything gets labeled foot control hardware. Every single unit on the bike that has its own specific hardware has to stay or be labeled. I've had the shop here almost 2 years fully on my own, but I've had a workshop now privately for 4 years. I mostly deal with Harleys, but any background, any kind of custom fabrication at all is kind of welcome in the shop. High-end motorcycle fabrication is kind of the specialty. The most integral thing that you need before touching your motorcycle is getting the factory service manual. Every single motorcycle has a book. If you bring your bike to a mechanic, the mechanic has that book for your bike because you don't want to adjust anything, you don't want to change anything. If you don't know what you're doing, and you won't know what you're doing until you open up this service manual for this specific bike, and you go from there. Every instruction you could ever need to work on a motorcycle is in a service manual. Here's the clutch basket, clutch hub. We'll remove that. The adjustment nut on the clutch is through a threaded rod or a threaded arm with a flathead adjustment to lock it in. The flathead screwdriver fits into the threaded piece, and the lock nut is how you tighten it up. So you take that off completely remove any kind of tension system, and then you put on a washer that sits around the ring of the clutch springs. And when you tighten that up, what that does is because the washer is there, it forces the springs tight. That gives you the opportunity to loosen all the nuts that have pressure on them. So you take all those nuts off completely, and then you back off the clutch adjustment screw. And when you back off the clutch adjustment screw is when you remove everything else. All the springs come out of the clutch. You can remove the clutch basket, and there's a million little pieces in there. All the pressure plates for the clutch. The basic thing that you start with is you remove the chain tensioner. The chain tensioner is the unit there that's in between the two sprockets. It's a polyurethane slide, basically, that you adjust the height up and down because over time your chain's going to stretch. What the tensioner does is keep it within spec. Once the clutch is fully removed, move to the front and take off the compensator nut. The one thing to note about this is that it's reverse threaded. And the reason this is reverse threaded is because of the motion of the engine. If it were moving in the same direction as a classic right-hand threaded thread, which is standard for everything, it would loosen itself. So what it does is the opposite. It actually tightens itself. This is one of the specific times where you use an impact gun on the bike. Everything else is not really necessary. Most engines, especially outside of Harley design, they have what's called like a unit construction, so the transmission and the motor are all in one case. This is completely separate. So the motor and transmission are completely separate from each other, and this is how they're attached. Once you get the clutch plates out, you need what's called a clutch hub puller, which is a specific tool for this job. It mounts onto the fingers of the clutch hub that you just removed the nuts and the springs from. And then there's basically just a big bolt, and you crank on that. You can do it by hand if necessary, but it's kind of difficult. The right way to do it is with an impact gun, and you just crank it, and what it does is it forces that bolt in, pushes against the transmission shaft, and then pulls the hub of the clutch off so it comes off as a unit. There's different ways to stop up the clutch hub from actually moving. There's a very basic way. I've got like a hefty screwdriver, and you shove it in between the forks and you just kind of go to town. What's actually happening is it's forcing the clutch hub to be pulled off of the shaft. This clutch hub puller in particular, you can see there's a bunch of holes in the faceplate, and it's because this one is actually set up for multiple kinds of clutch baskets and different kinds of bikes. It does almost every single kind of removal because of the hole layout. There's like multiple different hole layouts on that one plate. And then you just remove all the inner primary hardware to remove the inner primary itself. We got a pry bar. It's got a little rubber foot on it. It's something that you incorporate as necessary. You don't want to have metal on metal as much as possible. That guy's got a little rubber foot for leverage. It's by feel. A lot of times if you need to use a pry bar, you want to put a wooden block or some kind of rubber, some kind of buffer between the metal so you don't scratch it. Not always necessary. I just used it because it's efficient. We're almost down to the bare motor and transmission. That's the turning point in taking apart the bike. Once the motor and transmission out, you've already done all the hard stuff, and it's just kind of taking bolts off, and you don't have as much to worry about after that. I'm just taking off the shifter arm from the transmission that was attached to the shift lever that we removed earlier. The shift lever that we removed earlier is just linkage that sends a direction to that, and then the shifter arm changes the gears inside the transmission. The transmission itself is a 4-speed. Later models, 5-speed, 6-speed. 6-speed is generally an overdrive gear for highway riding. Here, what happened when removing the shift arm, one of the Allen head bolts that were holding the shift arm to the drum, and one of them was stripped. And so what I did is I took a similar sized Torx head socket and hammered it in, because the bolt afterwards isn't salvageable anyway. So you basically force something in that is a similar shape, but the Torx head has almost a spiked or star pattern. So it forces itself in, and then you can hopefully get the bolt removed fairly easily. So what I'm doing here is I'm just popping a couple of the bolts back in to keep the cover on the shift drum there. Once all the hardware is removed, and where we've already removed the carburetor, any kind of sensitive equipment, once these 4 bolts are removed, you can just slide the motor out from the side. In other bikes, there's different ways to do it, but this is what works for this shovel head. I would say the engine's around 150 pounds off the top of my head. It's definitely not light. I'm taking off the right side of the rear motor mount hardware. There's 4 mounting points, and you just kind of work your way around the bike to get it all out of there. Right now, actually, what I'm doing is removing the oil lines that feed the oil pump and return from the oil pump. When removing the oil lines, everything is attached by hose clamps here, which are engaged with a flathead screwdriver, flathead worm drive. One of the lines itself had become hard and dry, and so the best thing to do, because all these lines are going to have to get replaced in an old bike like this anyway, is just to cut it, and it makes the process a lot quicker. Making sure all the oil lines are disconnected and all the hardware is removed from the motor mounts, we're going to go ahead and pull the motor out of the frame. There's mounting hardware on the top that keeps those rocker boxes attached to the motor, and everybody wants to put their flavor on their bike. What happened here is that there's acorn nuts put on, which are basically a blind nut that have a little crown on top. They're not through. You can't tighten them. They're decorative. The problem with the acorn nuts in this scenario is that they were too tall and we couldn't pull the motor from the frame directly. So one of the acorn nuts on the rocker box had to be removed to get the motor out of the frame. Here we're pulling the engine right out of the frame. This is the first time this bike's ever been fully disassembled since it's been mine. We're discovering a lot along the way as we're taking everything apart. The transmission itself is mounted to a plate, and the plate is mounted to the frame. The transmission plate is fixed to the frame in a fixed position. The slots that the transmission is mounted to can move back and forth, forward and aft, basically. And what that does is it gives you adjustment for the primary tension, if necessary. What it's really for is alignment. Here I'm actually removing the chain from the bike, and that's just to be able to pull the transmission out easier, because removing the chain from that sprocket, otherwise it'd get caught up and kind of tangled. I'm using a chain breaker here. The chain breaker drives the pin through the side and out the other side, and so it removes one of the pins so you can break the chain. Basically, your engine is creating whatever RPM, whatever power that you're giving it through the throttle, which comes through the carburetor and the gas. So that then has to be transferred through something because otherwise if you had it directly hooked up to your rear wheel would spin at exactly the same rate or whatever gear ratio you had set up by sprocket as the motor. So the transmission is the go-between, so you've got 4 speeds at different ratios that translated into smooth power to the rear wheel. So if you didn't have a transmission, it would literally be a single speed, and that single speed would be determined by the RPM of the motor. Something I ran into is this piece of hardware is actually preventing the transmission from coming out of the frame, so it's just something to pop off really quick to make sure that you've got clean access to get everything out of there without having to force it. You never want to force anything in like dismantling a motorcycle at all, because if you're forcing it, you're doing it wrong. Now the transmission's coming out of the frame, just kind of got to wiggle it around a little bit to get clear of everything. This is an electric start model, but for this era, what that meant is it had electric start in addition to kickstart. So it transfers electrical power into mechanical power. But with the kickstart system, it's straight force, like physical force. So you use that kickstart as a lever to physically turn over the motor with your leg. So that's what creates the cycle when using a kickstart. What we're doing here is removing the sissy bar from the fender struts. This is an aftermarket add-on, and basically all it is just mounts to the fender struts. It's a unit that you can like mount any kind of like baggage. Again, it's not something that comes standard on all bikes, but it's something that is kind of like iconic to the era. After we have the sissy bar removed, detach the rest of the hardware that holds the fender to the fender struts, and right now, the way that I've done it is I've left the rear taillight attached and all the wiring, just because whenever this goes back together, it's just easier to plug and play all back in. Now that we have the fender off, we're going to remove the rear wheel. Very basic, it's just a rod with a threaded nut at the end that goes through on like the axle. You take off the nut on one side and you have to drive the axle all the way through the hub to get the wheel out. Once you get the axle out, you just pull the wheel out, super easy. There are spacers on either side of the hub that keep the wheel centered where it needs to be in line with the chassis. So those spacers are really important. They can't be loose, they can't be too tight, especially on early style or Timken style bearings like this. Now that we've got the rear wheel off, I'm removing the rear brake caliper. I'm taking off the rear brake caliper as a unit with the brake arm and the brake line. The rear brake caliper is the housing that holds the brake pads. The brake pads are around the rotor. What happens is the plunger that we discussed earlier that goes into the master cylinder transfers the pressure, and then the fluid pressure is actually what pushes the little pistons inside the brake caliper to engage, and all it is force. So the brake pads literally get pressed up onto the rotor, and that's what stops the bike. Right here, I'm removing the rear passenger pegs. These pegs in particular are some aftermarket passenger pegs that mount directly to the frame with a clamp style system. You'll see a million different kinds of these. Now that we've got those removed, I'm going to go ahead and start removing the rear shocks. Basically, this is the rear suspension system, so when you're riding down the road, this is what provides the comfort. The way that I learned and the way that I came up in this industry is just by hard work and problem solving. And that's kind of the way that I tackle every project now. Is it's the passion behind it that lets me use my creativity to develop something, but it's about problem solving along the way. That's part of the hurdles are what you have to get over, and it's all part of the fun. Once you remove the rear shocks, you can drop the rear swing arm, and then you can take off the rest of the fender struts. Here we are removing the headlight on the bike. Now I'm taking the hand controls off of the handlebars. Right there, I'd remove the clutch lever and the line. And now I'm removing the throttle and the throttle cable as well. And right there, I'm removing the front brake lever. Once all that's removed, I can take the bolts out of the handlebars and take the handlebars off of the triple tree of the fork. Now I'm taking the front axle out, and so we can remove the front wheel. Exactly the same process as the back, except for the fact of these pinch bolts in the fork. So you take off these pinch bolts in this plate completely after taking the nut off of the left-hand side, and then you just tap the axle out and the wheel comes out. A lot of times if you're just removing the front wheel, depending on the setup, you might want to remove the front fender first before removing the front wheel. This just happened to be easier today. Again, same system as the back. There's front and rear disc brakes on this bike. Just removing it from the fork leg. Now we're down to almost a bare frame. It's just a matter of popping off the front fender and taking off the front fork, and the bike will be completely disassembled. So here I am removing the front fender. Again, when you're doing this, you want to be careful to make sure you don't scratch anything. Be careful of all the paint. That's the main thing when taking apart a bike, is you don't want to scratch anything, don't want to damage anything that's not going to be replaced, and the paint is definitely something you don't want to have to do again. Right now I'm moving the top nuts of the fork tubes so they can slide out of the triple tree. One thing to be very careful of as well when you're removing these, it's a hardened chrome slider. It's a hydraulic system. You don't want to break a seal or give it a reason to break a seal anywhere. Here I am just removing the right side fork tube. The triple tree is the clamp that holds the fork tubes, which lead down into the fork lowers or fork legs, and that's your whole steering system right there. This particular system, it's really common. They're called wide glide trees. It's denoted by the spacing between the fork tubes, and you pop the top caps off, and then you take off the pinch bolts on the lower part of the triple tree and just slide them out. And now that the fork tubes are removed, you're going to remove the stem nut for the triple tree. Once the nut's removed, you're going to drop the bottom tree out and take the top tree off. I don't know when the last time it was ever removed, so I had to take a couple of blows with the dead blow hammer. The dead blow hammer is nice because it has a force behind it, but it's also soft face, so it doesn't do any damage to the part itself. Now that we're stripped down to the bare frame, the one thing that was left on was the swing arm, which can be removed and swapped out if need be, but generally there's no need to ever remove the swing arm unless it's being replaced with something else. And that's it. This is a fully deconstructed Harley-Davidson shovel head, and it's all laid out here so you can see the inner workings of the motorcycle.